Something is approaching, and if you have been wondering why your emotions have become more intense, why your thoughts refuse to settle, or why an invisible force seems to be pushing you toward a decision you have avoided for far too long, then you need to pay very close attention. This is not one of those ordinary weeks that quietly slips by without leaving a mark. There are moments in astrology that simply describe the emotional weather, and then there are moments that expose the direction your entire path has been taking beneath the surface. What is unfolding now belongs to that second category. I do not say that lightly. On Monday, July 6th, the moon enters Aries. At first glance, that may seem routine because the moon changes signs regularly, and experienced astrology followers know that lunar ingresses happen frequently. Yet this particular entrance cannot be separated from the larger celestial pattern surrounding it. It arrives after several days of mounting pressure, unresolved momentum, and planetary dynamics that have been quietly preparing the stage. That is exactly why this moment deserves your attention. I believe it may become one of the defining energetic turning points of this entire month, perhaps even one of the most influential periods of the summer. The reason I wanted to speak about it before it unfolds is simple. If there has been a conversation living inside you that never found its voice, if there has been a choice you already knew needed to be made, but fear continued delaying it, if you have remained frozen between certainty and hesitation, then this Aries moon may become the force that finally breaks that internal stalemate. Whether you feel prepared or completely caught off guard, the energy arriving on Monday has the potential to move what has remained motionless. Still, there is an important layer that cannot be ignored. Less than one full day after the moon steps into Aries, another powerful cosmic event arrives, and it is not designed to congratulate your courage. Instead, it asks a difficult question. Is the action you are taking rooted in something authentic and enduring, or is it resting on a foundation too weak to survive real pressure? That examination becomes incredibly important, and I will return to it later because understanding it changes the entire meaning of what happens next. Before we can reach that point, however, we have to understand why this Aries moon carries so much weight. It is not appearing in a peaceful sky. It is entering an atmosphere that has already been charged with emotional electricity, psychological tension, and accumulated momentum. Once you recognize everything that has been developing before this lunar ingress, many of the emotions you have struggled to explain throughout this week may suddenly begin making perfect sense. The sky has not shifted overnight. It has been preparing for this exact moment, little by little. The process began on July 4th, only 2 days before the moon enters Aries, when Mars formed an exact conjunction with Uranus in Gemini. Anyone familiar with the symbolism of Mars and Uranus understands that this combination rarely behaves quietly. It carries the feeling of compressed energy finally breaking free. It resembles a storm that builds in silence before releasing its full force without warning. Mars represents instinctive movement, determination, raw motivation, and the desire to stop overthinking and simply act. Uranus represents disruption, awakening, unexpected change, revolutionary breakthroughs, and sudden turns that refuse to ask permission from anyone. It interrupts patterns that have become stagnant and replaces predictability with rapid transformation. When these two planetary forces unite, especially in Gemini, the sign connected with communication, information, learning, conversations, and the power of words, something internal often reaches its limit. A mental barrier gives way. A realization becomes impossible to ignore. A truth that has remained trapped beneath politeness or caution suddenly demands expression. I suspect many of you have already begun experiencing the first waves of this influence. Perhaps your body has carried an unusual sense of restlessness, almost as though every nerve has become more alert than normal. Perhaps sleep has felt lighter, your breathing different, your thoughts impossible to slow down. Or maybe the experience has been entirely mental. New ideas may have appeared unexpectedly. Old plans may suddenly seem impossible to postpone any longer. Conversations you rehearsed repeatedly in your imagination may now feel ready to leave your lips. You may have noticed yourself opening a message, writing exactly what you wanted to say, only to erase every word moments later because doubt returned before courage could fully arrive. If any of that sounds familiar, then you are not imagining it. The conjunction between Mars and Uranus has been loosening everything that has remained emotionally locked inside you. It has been shaking loose suppressed frustrations, postponed decisions, carefully calculated risks that never became reality, and truths you convinced yourself could wait another day. Every time you chose silence instead of honesty, every time you delayed an action because perfect certainty never arrived, the pressure quietly continued accumulating beneath the surface. By the time the moon crosses into Aries on July 6th, that emotional pressure reaches a point where release becomes increasingly difficult to avoid. Yet just before that release can happen, another experience arrives, and this one may feel surprisingly uncomfortable because it asks you to confront the very fears that have kept you standing still. Sometimes the greatest breakthrough does not begin with excitement. Sometimes it begins with resistance so intense that you briefly believe everything is moving backward. During the morning of July 6th, only hours before the moon enters Aries, the Sun in Cancer forms an exact square with Saturn in Aries. Saturn has a way of making every unresolved insecurity feel visible. Its influence often feels weighty, demanding, and impossible to ignore. It brings responsibility into direct contact with hesitation. It forces you to examine every excuse that once felt convincing. Meanwhile, the Cancer Sun naturally seeks emotional security. It wants familiarity, protection, comfort, and environments where vulnerability feels safe. It prefers shelter over uncertainty. Saturn stands directly opposite that instinct and challenges it with uncomfortable honesty. It asks whether the place you continue calling safety has quietly become a prison built from your own fears. It questions whether the comfort you have been defending is actually preventing your growth instead of preserving your peace. That internal conflict between remaining where life feels predictable and stepping toward what your soul already knows must happen may become the dominant emotional experience for many people on Monday morning. It may appear as overwhelming self-doubt. It may arrive as an invisible heaviness pressing against your chest before the day has even begun. You may feel surrounded by unfinished responsibilities, old disappointments, and every opportunity you believe slipped away. For a brief moment, it may seem as though every door is closing at once, as though the universe itself is denying your progress. That sensation can feel painfully real, yet understanding why it appears becomes the key to recognizing what this extraordinary sequence of planetary events is truly preparing you to face. And that realization leads directly into what comes next. Before you allow that feeling of resistance to convince you that you should retreat, there is something you absolutely need to recognize. What feels like the greatest obstacle is not evidence that you are moving in the wrong direction. It is the final barrier standing between who you have been and who you are about to become. That pressure has a purpose. It is not random, and it is not punishment. It exists because at 11 o'clock in the morning, the moon leaves Pisces, the place where emotions can become endless, where clarity dissolves into uncertainty, where everything seems to blur together until it becomes difficult to separate intuition from fear. Then everything changes. The moon crosses into Aries at 0 degrees, the very first degree of the zodiac itself. Symbolically, there is no more powerful place to begin. It is the first breath after holding your lungs empty. It is the instant before a runner launches from the starting line. It is the point where hesitation can no longer maintain control. The emotional weight created earlier by the exact square between the Sun in Cancer and Saturn in Aries does not simply fade away as though nothing happened. Instead, the entire emotional structure transforms. The pressure that once felt unbearable becomes fuel. The heaviness that seemed determined to stop your progress suddenly becomes the force pushing you forward. The Aries Moon takes everything that has been compressed inside you and redirects it into momentum, courage, determination, and decisive movement. That is why this particular lunar ingress feels so extraordinary. It is not merely offering another beginning. It represents the instant when months of emotional restraint finally lose their grip. It is the breakthrough after believing the wall would never move. As I have reflected on this energy throughout the week, one image has returned again and again. I do not see someone carefully opening a locked door. I see someone crashing through a barrier that appeared permanent only moments before. There is nothing gentle about this transition. It is immediate, forceful, and impossible to ignore. That is why I keep describing it as a comeback rather than simply a fresh start. Those two ideas may sound similar, but energetically they are completely different. A fresh start suggests beginning from nothing. A comeback means rediscovering something that never truly disappeared. The moon in Aries carries cardinal fire. It represents the first spark, the original instinct to survive, to initiate, to fight for existence itself. Under this lunar placement, the endless cycle of overthinking begins to lose its authority. Waiting for perfect certainty becomes less important than responding to what feels undeniably true inside you. The distance between feeling an impulse and acting upon it becomes incredibly small. Under ordinary circumstances, that kind of immediate energy could certainly create impulsive choices or unnecessary risks. Yet July 6th is operating within a much larger astrological story. This is not reckless movement emerging from impatience. This is the release of energy that has been intentionally building through everything that came before it. The exact square between the Sun and Saturn created emotional compression. The exact conjunction between Mars and Uranus generated the electrical charge beneath the surface. Then the Aries Moon arrives and becomes the moment when holding yourself back no longer feels possible. Many people may notice this shift, not only emotionally, but physically as well. You could experience a sudden rush of adrenaline that seems to appear without explanation. Your body may become unusually restless, making it difficult to remain still. You may feel an almost overwhelming urge to stand up, to move, to make a phone call, to send the message you kept postponing, to begin the project that has remained trapped inside your imagination. If that sensation arrives on Monday, pay attention to it instead of dismissing it. Your body and your emotional instincts may be speaking the same language for the first time in a long while. Rather than resisting the movement, recognize that this surge has an astrological purpose. It reflects an internal readiness that has been developing beneath your awareness. There is another detail within this celestial pattern that makes the entire sequence remarkably interconnected. Once the moon enters Aries, it comes under the rulership of Mars. Mars is currently traveling through Gemini, a sign ruled by Mercury. Mercury, in turn, is currently moving through Cancer, a sign ruled by the moon. The result is a complete energetic circuit. The moon leads to Mars. Mars leads to Mercury. Mercury returns directly to the moon. Nothing exists in isolation. Your emotional instincts influence the thoughts forming inside your mind. Those thoughts become the words you choose to speak. Those words naturally evolve into actions. Every part of the chain is connected, and each link strengthens the next. Your emotions are not competing with your logic during this period. They are feeding it. Your communication is not detached from your heart. It grows directly out of your deepest emotional reality. Your actions are not random displays of courage. They are rooted in something profoundly personal, protective, and meaningful. That is why this comeback feels impossible to separate from your own life story. This is not distant symbolism happening somewhere in the heavens while your daily life remains untouched. The astrology is reflecting the exact place where you have felt delayed, uncertain, or emotionally trapped. It is offering an internal structure capable of moving what previously refused to move. While every person will feel the influence of the Aries moon in some way, there are three signs that appear to stand directly beneath this current of transformation. Whether these signs appear as your sun, moon, or rising, the symbolism becomes especially significant. The astrological picture points toward an invitation that feels unusually direct. For Aries in particular, this moment carries the unmistakable feeling of reclaiming something that has seemed distant for quite some time. If your chart is strongly influenced by Aries, listen carefully, because this message speaks directly to the experience many of you have quietly carried. Saturn has been traveling through your sign, and that influence rarely creates dramatic challenges overnight. Instead, it slowly accumulates weight until even your natural confidence begins questioning itself. Aries is known for moving first, for trusting instinct, for meeting life head-on. Yet Saturn has required patience, discipline, limitation, and repeated self-examination. Over time, that process can leave even the strongest Aries wondering whether something essential has disappeared. Perhaps you have caught yourself questioning abilities that once felt effortless. Perhaps you have wondered whether your confidence had somehow faded, or whether the fearless version of yourself belonged to the past instead of the future. Even if those thoughts remained hidden from everyone else, they may have continued echoing quietly inside you. If that inner conversation has been present, understand this: your fire was never extinguished. It was concentrated. It was compressed beneath responsibility, delay, and repeated testing. On July 6, when the moon enters your own sign and immediately forms a trine with Jupiter in Leo, everything that has been compressed begins changing into forward momentum. The exact square between the Sun in Cancer and Saturn in Aries earlier that same morning first requires you to face whatever has been limiting your growth with complete honesty. Whatever has been keeping you confined is about to become impossible to ignore. It could be a career that has slowly drained your enthusiasm until showing up each day feels more like survival than purpose. It could be a relationship where you have gradually reduced your own light just to maintain peace, convincing yourself that shrinking was easier than being fully seen. Or perhaps the greatest obstacle has never existed outside of you at all, but instead has lived quietly within your own thoughts, repeating the same familiar message that tells you to wait a little longer to avoid unnecessary risks, to remain patient until some perfect future moment finally arrives. Then the moon enters Aries, and the entire emotional atmosphere changes. The hesitation that has been tolerated for so long reaches its limit. It becomes the moment when your inner world finally declares that enough is enough. For you, the first courageous step is not about proving bravery through reckless decisions. It is about refusing to continue living beneath your true capacity. It is about reclaiming the version of yourself that has been hidden beneath caution, doubt, and compromise. Mars, your ruling planet, is currently moving through Gemini, placing extraordinary emphasis on communication, clarity, and the power of decisive words. That means the conversation you have postponed, the message sitting unsent, the boundary you have hesitated to establish, or the truth you have repeatedly rehearsed in silence already exists inside you. You are not searching for the right words because they are already there. What changes on Monday is your willingness to finally speak them. Even though Saturn may continue whispering that the timing is still imperfect, the broader astrological picture tells a different story. Waiting until every uncertainty disappears has never been the real requirement. The defining moment arrives when remaining trapped becomes more painful than taking the first step forward. That is the doorway this Aries moon opens for you. If your chart is strongly influenced by Leo, another story is unfolding at the same time, and chances are you have already sensed its first signs, even if you have not yet fully understood what was changing. Think back to the closing days of June. There may have been a quiet but unmistakable feeling that the atmosphere around your life was beginning to expand. Perhaps nothing dramatic happened externally, yet internally something felt different, almost as though possibility itself had begun breathing again. There is a clear astrological reason for that sensation. On June 30th, Jupiter entered Leo. This is one of the most uplifting and expansive planetary cycles available to your sign. It arrives only once every 12 years, making it a rare opportunity to grow in confidence, visibility, and personal expression. Yet Jupiter is often misunderstood. It does not simply distribute rewards without participation. Instead, it magnifies whatever you actively choose to cultivate. It enlarges courage. It strengthens commitment. It increases the impact of every genuine effort you make. If you have been hiding your talents, minimizing your presence, waiting for validation from someone else before believing in yourself, or dismissing your own ideas because they seemed unworthy, Jupiter in Leo gradually makes that pattern impossible to tolerate. The contrast between your authentic potential and the smaller role you have accepted becomes increasingly impossible to ignore. On July 6th, the Moon in Aries forms an exact trine with Jupiter in your sign. Fire supports fire. Instinct aligns with expansion. Momentum meets opportunity. This harmonious connection creates the feeling that a final layer of self-doubt begins falling away. The first meaningful step for Leo now may appear in many different forms. It could mean presenting the creative project you have protected from criticism for too long. It could mean finally beginning the goal you have endlessly postponed while waiting for ideal circumstances. It could appear within your relationships, encouraging you to stop hoping someone else notices your value and instead embody it so completely that your presence naturally commands attention. The message carried by this astrology is remarkably consistent. Stop delaying your own arrival. Stop behaving as though you still need permission to occupy the place already meant for you. The true comeback for Leo is not about convincing the world of your worth. It is about living as someone who already understands it without needing external confirmation. One fascinating aspect of this energy is how naturally other people tend to respond when Leo fully embraces authenticity. Genuine confidence has its own unmistakable presence. Others recognize it almost immediately because it requires no performance. At the same time, Jupiter always asks for balance. The same influence capable of expanding opportunity can also magnify pride if left unchecked. Confidence becomes most powerful when it remains rooted in generosity, kindness, and warmth. Allow yourself to shine, but never lose the qualities that inspire others to stand beside you rather than beneath you. That combination creates influence that lasts. If Aquarius is strongly emphasized in your chart, the invitation arriving through this astrology follows an entirely different emotional path, and it may challenge some of your deepest habits. Aquarius naturally values independence, objectivity, and thoughtful observation. You often prefer understanding a situation completely before offering your emotions to it. That approach has protected you many times throughout your life. Yet the current planetary picture asks you to experiment with something that may feel surprisingly unfamiliar. It asks you to lower the emotional barriers that have quietly become part of your identity. With Jupiter now traveling through Leo, your opposite sign, the area of your chart connected with partnerships, committed relationships, and meaningful one-on-one connections becomes illuminated. Jupiter brings growth wherever it travels, and here it emphasizes the importance of allowing another person to stand beside you rather than believing every challenge must be carried alone. The period of complete self-reliance begins, giving way to a new chapter centered on connection, cooperation, and shared experience. Then the Aries Moon on July 6th activates another important piece of the story. As it moves through your communication sector, it forms a supportive sextile with your sign, while simultaneously creating a trine with Jupiter occupying your relationship sector. At the same time, the exact conjunction between Mars and Uranus that occurred on July 4th activates your fifth house, the area traditionally associated with romance, creativity, joy, emotional expression, playful exploration, and the willingness to place your heart where uncertainty still exists. Together, these planetary movements create an unmistakable message. The next meaningful breakthrough is unlikely to arrive by remaining emotionally protected from a distance. The astrological pattern becomes remarkably precise from this point forward. Every major influence seems to point in the same direction, almost as though each planetary movement is reinforcing the next, until a single message becomes impossible to ignore. For Aquarius, that message is not about maintaining distance any longer. It is about lowering the emotional defenses that have become so familiar they almost feel like part of your identity. The first courageous step may not resemble a dramatic declaration or an unforgettable romantic scene. In fact, it may appear surprisingly ordinary. It could be finally sending the message that has remained unfinished while you analyzed every possible outcome for 3 straight days. It could mean accepting an invitation instead of immediately searching for reasons why it might fail. It could even begin with a deeply private moment where you admit, honestly and without judgment, that you genuinely want closeness instead of pretending complete self-sufficiency satisfies every emotional need. Independence is one of your greatest strengths, but sometimes what appears to be freedom is actually an incredibly sophisticated form of self-protection. If hearing that creates even a slight sense of discomfort, there is a good chance it touches something important. That observation is not a criticism of the Aquarius way of moving through life. Quite the opposite. Your ability to think independently and maintain perspective is one of your greatest gifts. Yet the current astrology is not encouraging you to abandon your nature. It is simply inviting you to allow another human being to step inside the space you have guarded so carefully. The Aries Moon supplies the emotional courage required to make that choice. Your comeback is not defined by becoming someone different. It is defined by rediscovering the willingness to desire connection without demanding absolute certainty before opening your heart. Of the 3 signs highlighted by this astrology, that may require the greatest form of bravery, because vulnerability always asks for trust before guarantees exist. Earlier I mentioned that something significant follows almost immediately after the moon enters Aries. And this is the moment I wanted you to stay for, because it changes the interpretation of everything that comes before it. On July 7th, less than 24 hours after the moon crosses into Aries, Neptune stations retrograde at 4 degrees Aries. As the moon continues traveling through those early degrees, it moves directly across this stationary Neptune, creating an exceptionally meaningful encounter. Neptune governs dreams, imagination, ideals, illusions, spiritual longing, and the stories we tell ourselves about what we hope is true. While Neptune is moving forward through Aries, it can inspire tremendous conviction. It can leave you feeling spiritually empowered, completely certain of your direction, convinced that your vision is unquestionably aligned with reality. Yet the moment Neptune stations retrograde, the atmosphere changes. It is as though a veil begins lifting. The haze that once softened every outline gradually disappears, allowing reality to emerge with far greater definition. Once that clarity arrives, not every belief formed during the fog will remain standing. That realization carries profound importance for whatever you choose to begin on July 6th. Whether your first step involves an honest conversation, an emotional confession, a bold professional decision, or another meaningful action, Neptune retrograde immediately places that decision under examination. It quietly asks a single question that cannot be avoided. Is this action grounded in authentic truth, or has it been shaped by desperation, personal pride, wishful thinking, or an imagined version of reality that never truly existed? There is no reason to interpret this as a warning against courage. In many ways, it is incredibly encouraging because it reveals how genuine intentions become stronger under honest examination. If your decision on July 6th grows from a sincere understanding of who you are and what your life genuinely requires, Neptune retrograde becomes an ally rather than an obstacle. It dissolves illusion while protecting authenticity. Everything built upon truth remains standing after the unnecessary distractions disappear. However, if your actions are motivated primarily by loneliness, by the desire to prove your worth, or by expectations that exist only inside your imagination instead of objective reality, the events of July 7th may expose that difference. Such realizations can certainly feel uncomfortable, yet they ultimately prevent you from investing your future in something that was never capable of lasting. That is why honesty becomes more valuable than certainty during this period. Move forward with confidence on Monday, but remain deeply truthful about the reasons driving your choices. Let evidence outweigh assumption. Allow reality to speak more loudly than fantasy. That approach aligns beautifully with the deeper purpose of Neptune's retrograde station. There is another significant development unfolding on July 7th as well. The Moon reaches 15 degrees Aries and forms a square with the Sun in Cancer, marking the last quarter moon phase. Within astrological timing, this phase often represents a moment of testing, adjustment, and internal conflict. It is the point where fresh momentum encounters resistance and asks whether your commitment is strong enough to continue. The Cancer Sun naturally encourages retreat toward emotional familiarity, safety, and established patterns. Meanwhile, the Aries Moon insists that genuine progress requires continuing forward instead of returning to what has already been outgrown. You are likely to experience that conflict internally. Doubt may appear almost immediately after your courageous decision. You may find yourself questioning your own actions, wondering whether you spoke too honestly, acted too quickly, or revealed more than you intended. Thoughts urging you to reverse course may seem surprisingly convincing. Yet this emotional tension is not evidence that you made a mistake. It is the examination itself. The universe is not punishing your courage. It is measuring your commitment to it. Was your decision inspired by a genuine transformation taking place inside you, or was it nothing more than a temporary emotional surge? If you can remain present with the discomfort, instead of allowing it to pull you backward, if you acknowledge the temptation to retreat, yet continue honoring the direction you have already chosen, then you successfully move through this important phase of the cycle. Beyond that point, the larger pattern of the month begins revealing its remarkable design. The events of early July are not isolated experiences. They belong to a much broader progression that steadily unfolds throughout the remainder of the month. On July 22nd, the Sun enters Leo, introducing a brighter, more expressive chapter of the astrological story. On July 23rd, Mercury finally turns direct after its retrograde journey through Cancer, allowing communication, understanding, and forward momentum to flow with far greater ease. Then comes one of the most significant alignments of the entire year. On July 29th, the Sun forms a Casimir conjunction with Jupiter in Leo, an exceptionally powerful combination associated with expansion, confidence, opportunity, and extraordinary potential for growth. On that very same day, the full moon rises in Aquarius, illuminating everything that first began moving when the moon entered Aries at the beginning of the month. Suddenly, the entire sequence becomes visible as one connected narrative rather than separate events. The courageous choice you make on July 6th is not an isolated moment destined to disappear after a single day. It becomes the first thread, woven through every major development that follows. The boldness awakened by the Aries moon is refined through experience, challenged through self-examination, clarified by Neptune retrograde, strengthened by the last quarter moon, and ultimately supported by the extraordinary alignments waiting near the end of July. Something that begins as one honest decision has the potential to grow into a genuinely meaningful transformation by the 29th. That is perhaps the most valuable lesson contained within this entire astrological sequence. Real change rarely arrives through one dramatic moment alone. It begins when one courageous decision creates momentum that future opportunities can continue building upon. The seed is planted on July 6th. The remainder of the month nurtures its growth, yet the first movement always belongs to you. It begins with the willingness to acknowledge fear without surrendering to it. It begins by moving beyond the limitations revealed through Saturn, embracing the courage awakened by the Aries Moon, and trusting that the path opening before you is rooted in something genuine. Before we finish, I simply want to thank you for staying with me all the way to the end. I know this has been a longer journey, and your willingness to spend this time here truly means more than you probably realize. If this message connected with your own experience, I would be incredibly grateful if you chose to subscribe, because your support allows these conversations to continue reaching people who may need them. I would also love to hear from you in the comments. Tell me which of the 3 signs you identify with most strongly. Share the decision, conversation, or opportunity you have been postponing. I have a feeling many of us are moving through this powerful astrological chapter together, and hearing your story may help someone else recognize they are not walking this path alone. Take good care of yourself throughout this week, and I look forward to sharing the next journey with you very soon.